Greetings, this is Alex Vasquez from Evolutionary Athletics again, and I am here to continue my discussion about block periodization. So in the previous video, we talked about the two key principles that are related to block periodization, that is concentrated loading and the long-term delayed training effect. And the last video went more in depth into concentrated loading. This video, I'm going to talk to you more about the long-term delayed training effect. The long-term delayed training effect. Essentially, what it refers to is how long the training effect, or the improvements or gains that you get from a concentrated loading phase, will last for various qualities, like strength, power, velocity, or endurance. So essentially, if you do a concentrated loading phase of maximal strength training, it will leave almost like residual, like a fingerprint. Those strength gains will continue to rise and increase for a period of time after you stop training for maximal strength, which is great because that means we can get stronger while we're not actually lifting maximal weights. So way back in the days, the Russians decided to test out the effects of concentrated loading and how long the gains or improvements lasted once they ceased training for that specific goal. And on this chart we see here that the Soviets found aerobic endurance lasted 30 days plus or minus 5 days, so anywhere from 25 to 35 days after they ceased aerobic exercise. Maximal strength also lasted for 30 days. Glycolytic endurance, like is needed in sports like ice hockey, lasts about 18 days. Strength endurance lasts 15, and power or speed lasts, high velocity work lasts about 5 days. So the long-term delayed training effect, how does this work in the real world? Well, while the Soviets found those lengths of the residual training effect or the long-term training effect after they ceased training, after reviewing a number of Soviet books, Verkhoshansky's work, and a number of strength and conditioning texts written by various strength coaches, I saw that in application, generally the length of the long-term delayed training effect was roughly equal to the length of the concentrated loading phase. So if you trained maximal strength for 4 weeks, afterwards the long-term delayed training effect would last for 4 weeks. You'd continue to get stronger for 4 weeks. So that would mean you're increasing strength all the way up until about week 8. If you trained maximal strength for 2 weeks, then it would last for 2 weeks. What we tend to see is as we get to higher and higher velocity work, the phases tend to shorten. So the high velocity work, the peaking phase, lasts about 1 to 2 weeks, and hence its long-term delayed training effect only lasts about 1 to 2 weeks. Because we know we can determine how long these effects will last if we use concentrated loading, it makes programming pretty simple for the most part, even though it may seem a little complex in the beginning. If we sequence everything properly, we get a synergistic effect. So, for example, in the long-term delayed training effect, the way we sequence our programming to take advantage of this is strength comes first, then power, and then our peaking high velocity phase. So if we time it right, when we reach the peaking phase, our strength will actually be maximized. If we sequence everything properly, when we reach the peaking phase, our power will actually be maximized. And this results overall in a synergistic peak in speed and performance. So what we see is, rather than a 1 + 1 + 1 = 3, we kind of get a 1 + 1 + 1 = 6 training effect, because maximal strength, maximal power, maximal velocity are all peaked on game day or whenever we need to be at our optimal performance levels. Some simple guidelines for the application of training and the long-term delayed training effect. If you need to combine two concentrated loading site parameters or goals into 1 week, you need to pick two that fall next to each other on the force velocity curve. For example, you could mix a strength and a power cycle together, or a power and a speed or velocity peaking phase together, but you wouldn't want to mix strength and a peaking phase because the goals are too far away from each other, and that will lead us further away from a concentrated effort and into a more diluted, more mixed training type of training effect, which, as we already discussed, produces low-level results. Another simple guideline for block periodization is for in-season programming. Generally speaking, I like to cut volume. I still use concentrated loads, but I prefer to cut the volume by 1/3 to 1/2. The simplest way for me is removing 1 to 2 training days. So for most athletes or teams, I think 2 days a week with your strength training as well as, or your special strength training as well as with a running program is more than enough. So we'd go from 3 days a week or 4 days a week down to 2 days a week. If you're training 6 days a week, you could go down to either 3 to 4 days a week if you wanted. But still, considering practice considerations and everything, I think 2 days a week will be most effective for most people. So with that in mind, I want to kind of go a little bit over what a concentrated load would look like, or what this would actually look like for us. So what we see here is in the bottom light blue is our training period. We have our phases, our strength phase, power phase, speed phase. At the top, we see the functional ability. This would be the long-term delayed training effect. So this is when each of these goals kind of kicks into play. So this is the residual left over from the concentrated phase. Again, we have strength, power, speed, and up top we have weeks. In red here, we have when do we want to peak our athlete. So when is the most important competition? So the first cycle is essentially a 12-week. It's a 3-month training program. This would be perfect for off-season conditioning. So what we see here is we train for maximal strength from weeks 1 all the way to week 6. The residual training effect, strength continues to improve for another 6 weeks. So from week 7 all the way out to week 12. Then what we see here is at week 7 we begin training for power. So we train for power for 3 weeks, week 7, 8, 9, and you see the residual kicks in as soon as we cease that power phase, and we see power peaking during weeks 10, 11, and 12. Finally, we go through our speed phase, high velocity movement. That's weeks 10 and 11, and the residual training effect again kicks in at week 12. So what we see here is at week 12, we see our speed, power, and maximal strength are all peaked at that one particular moment in time. At this point, our athlete is his fastest, most explosive self. Down here we see an example of two 6 to 7 week cycles. We train maximal strength from weeks 1 to 3. The residual kicks in and strength continues to increase from weeks 4 to 6. Week 7 we'll see a slight decline in strength, but actually not enough to really, it's not like your strength levels will plummet back down to where they were in the beginning. So strength will still stay elevated. You'll probably just lose about anywhere from 2 to 5% of your maximal strength in that week, which not a very significant amount. Then what we have here is our power phase. It goes from weeks 4 to 5, which means our power is peaking at week 6 and week 7. And then our velocity phase is week 6. And as a result, we see a strong, powerful, fast athlete during competition at week number 7. Then we can repeat the training cycle again for week number 14. I also mentioned that we could do something as short as a 3 or 4 week training cycle. This is actually an example of a 3-week training cycle where the athlete needs to peak at week 4 right here. So we do 2 intensive weeks with concentrated loading focusing on maximal strength, and then when we pull away, maximal strength will peak at week number 4. And then in week 3, and I discussed this during the earlier presentation, what we do is we actually combine the power and high velocity phase. So everything in week 3 is moving explosively. We got Olympic lifts, dynamic effort work, we can do some plyos and sprinting and all sorts of, all the fun kind of cool stuff. And we work really hard on those two, and those elements peak also again at week number 4. So in this case, if you have an important divisional rivalry football game or a conference game during the 4th week of the season, we can actually manipulate, as you can see, the training load so that our athletes will be the fastest, strongest, most explosive at that particular moment in time. And this is how we can manipulate the periodization cycle to ensure that at all of the key important dates in our training program, the athlete will, in our training cycle, when we're getting ready for spring ball and football, getting ready for the start of the season, maybe, and we talked about this. I talked about this before. Start of the season, peaking them at the playoffs. It's pretty easy to program because you just look at your training calendar and you highlight the most important weeks, kind of like what we did here in red. And then you just kind of work backwards from there. You go, okay, well, we need everything to peak at this date, so the strength phase has to be X long, the power phase then becomes X long, and then the high velocity peaking phase will fit right here. And if we do this right, they will be either strong, powerful, and moving at really high velocities at week 14 or at week 4, whatever week we want. So you just pick out those important dates that are important. The playoffs start, Super Bowl's here. Pretty easy to kind of work around a 4 week schedule to get you ready for the Super Bowl. That way, when we need to win that game, our team is going to be the fastest, strongest people on the field. So that's basically how you structure the periodization for block training. Pretty simple. Thank you. And I'll have another video coming up soon. If there's any topics anyone would like me to cover, you can feel free to shoot me an email, evolutionaryathletics@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to put a video together and answer some of your questions.